The night my husband put Recon outside in a storm, he thought he was showing me who held the power in that house. He was right about one thing. He was showing me exactly who he was. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had spent the last 6 weeks making sure I could prove it. And on the morning of the VA benefits hearing, when I finally opened my folder and began to speak, there wasn't a single person in that room who walked out the same way they walked in. I need to start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the silence starts. And the silence is where I became the most dangerous person in Warren Blackwell's world. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved, someone you had protected and provided for, slowly, quietly began to take everything from you, how long do you think you could stay silent? Type, "I would wait" in the comments if you believe patience is your greatest weapon. Type, "I would have spoken sooner" if you think silence costs too much. I read every single response. And stay with me, because what Warren Blackwell did, and what his mother helped him plan, and what I had already documented before either of them said a single word. That story is going to stay with you. My name is Miriam Alderton, and I came home from Kandahar with a traumatic brain injury, a diagnosed case of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a black Labrador retriever named Recon who had been trained at Fort Benning specifically for veterans like me. The IED that ended my Army career did not end me, but it changed the architecture of how I moved through the world. I startled at sounds that used to mean nothing. I lost stretches of time when the noise got too thick, when every sensation arrived at once, and my brain could not sequence them fast enough to keep up. I had nights that were not really nights at all, hours in the dark when the silence felt like a held breath, like something was always about to happen. Recon was the fix that the VA got right. He was trained to press his solid weight against my legs when the overwhelm started building before I even knew it was building. He slept at the foot of my bed, and the sound of him breathing, steady, reliable, indifferent to everything that frightened me, was the thing that kept the silence from caving in. The VA had documented him, certified him, and written explicitly in my medical file that he was not a pet. He was not a comfort object. He was a medical accommodation, a piece of my ongoing treatment plan, and that documentation had existed long before Warren Blackwell came into my life. I had bought the Alderton house on Jones Street in Savannah the year before I met Warren. It was a narrow, cream-colored row house with original heart pine floors and a garden that caught the morning light through a gap in the live oaks. I bought it on my VA home loan, in my name alone, with part of the settlement from my injury claim. My name on the deed, my loan number, my credit history that I had rebuilt carefully, methodically, over the 2 years since my discharge. I had also opened Ironwood Hotels that same year, a single boutique property 2 blocks from the Alderton house that I ran with the same precision I had once run supply chains in theater. I tracked every room's occupancy rate to the decimal. I knew my linen cost per stay, my average cleaning turnaround, my revenue per available room versus the comp set 2 streets over. I had rebuilt my life around structure and specificity because those were the things that held when everything else went sideways. They were what I knew how to build, and they were mine, and they were solid. Warren came to a veterans fundraiser at Ironwood. He was a city council member, the kind of handsome that photographs well and charms a room before anyone examines the edges too closely. He was attentive in a way that felt, at the time, like safety, like someone who was choosing to pay close attention because he genuinely saw something worth seeing. We married after 14 months. He moved into the Alderton house, and within a year, I began to notice the first thing that was off. It was small at first. A comment to my VA psychiatrist, which Dr. Ansel mentioned to me in passing, something Warren had apparently said in a brief hallway exchange describing one of my episodes in terms that didn't match what had actually happened. I had misplaced my keys. That was what had happened. I had put them in the wrong coat pocket and found them 20 minutes later. Warren had framed it to the doctor as a dissociative episode, with a concerned expression I could picture exactly, and Dr. Ansel had noted it in my file. I noted it the way I would note anything, without reaction, without confrontation. I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept in my bedside drawer, dated and specific, the way I had logged supply discrepancies in theater. When you track everything, nothing to sap. Ears. Then there was the joint account. Warren suggested we open one for household expenses, which seemed reasonable and practical, and I signed where he indicated without reading the authorization language with the attention it deserved. What I missed, that first time, was what I found 2 months later when I pulled the document back out and read the terms carefully. The account he had linked to mine was a sweep account. Anything deposited into my portion transferred automatically to the linked account within 48 hours. The linked account was in the name of Blackwell Campaign Consulting, a company I had never heard of and had never been told existed. I did not say a word about it. I wrote it down. Recon had already begun reacting to Warren in a way I recognized from his training, not aggression, but a deliberate, careful distance. Dogs trained for PTSD support are attuned to threat response at a frequency that human beings cannot consciously register. Recon would leave the room when Warren's voice shifted into a certain register. He would not settle near Warren on the couch the way he settled near me, would not bring him the tennis ball he brought me every evening at 6. I noticed. I said nothing, I wrote it down. The marriage had an architecture I had come to understand, and Warren had built it with a specific load-bearing purpose in mind. I just hadn't yet identified all of the structural elements, so I kept watching. Every note I made was dated. Every document I photographed was backed up to a cloud account Warren did not know existed, one I had created with an email address tied to an old military account. The notebook in my bedside drawer became a ledger not of feelings, not of grievances, but of facts. Times, dates, amounts, exact words, I gave it no name. Every evening before I slept, I opened it and added the day's entries. Recon would put his head on my knee while I wrote. I would scratch behind his ear. And I would think, not yet. That was the only thought, not yet. The night of the storm arrived in early September. Warren had invited 6 of his campaign donors to the Alderton house for dinner, the kind of evening that was really an audition, where every detail of the house was a prop, and I was expected to function as part of the set design. The Weather Service had issued a tropical storm advisory for the Georgia coast that afternoon, and the wind had already started by 5 in the evening. The low, pressing kind that makes the Spanish moss go flat, and the palmetto fronds turn their silver undersides to the sky. Warren met me in the kitchen at 6 and told me Recon needed to go outside for the evening. He sheds, Warren said. Hendrix is apparently allergic. It's just one night. I told him Recon was a certified service animal, that there was an active storm advisory, and that the east side of the yard had a gap in the fencing where the old gate had been removed. Warren's face went very still. I said it's one night, Miriam. There was a quality to his voice I had learned, never loud, not in front of people, not anywhere that volume could be noticed, but calibrated with a particular edge designed to remind me of something he believed about me, that I was fragile, that my reserves were lower than other people's, that I didn't have the fight left to push back. He had been cultivating that belief carefully, I now understood, for 2 full years. I put Recon in the kitchen anyway and shut the door behind me, and then I went upstairs and did not come down for the dinner. At 8:45 that evening, with the wind driving rain hard against the east-facing windows, Warren came upstairs. He was holding a document, the joint account authorization, but a new version, one I had not seen before. This one granted him sole withdrawal rights over my VA settlement account, the account holding the original $140,000 from my injury claim. He set it on the dresser in front of me and told me he needed it signed before the benefits hearing, next month. He said it would simplify the administration. He said it in the careful tone of a man explaining something basic to someone who might not follow. I picked up the document, I read the first 2 paragraphs. Then I set it down, told him I was tired, and turned out the light. He went back downstairs. 20 minutes later, I heard the back door open. Then the silence that told me Recon was outside, in the storm. Because Warren had decided that a campaign dinner was worth more than my service animal's safety, and because he had wanted me to understand, precisely and without any room for misinterpretation, what refusing him was going to cost. I brought Recon in after the last car left the driveway. He was soaked through to the skin, shaking in the controlled way that working dogs shake, not fear, but every nerve system overloaded, the wind and the sound and the unfamiliar duration of it all registering at once. I ushered him to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the tile floor with him while I worked through 2 beach towels getting him dry. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me. The steadiness wasn't numbness. It was the opposite. Something had finished forming in my chest that night, not rage, nothing that felt like an explosion waiting to happen. It was more like architecture. The decision that every movement I made from this point forward would be exact, documented, and unretrievable. In the days that followed, Recon would not go near the back door. Not to be let out in the morning, not when I stood beside it with his lead in my hand, not even when I propped it open and the garden smell came through. He would stop at the kitchen threshold and hold there, steady and immovable, and look at me with an expression I had learned to read over 4 years. A trained service dog does not flinch without reason. I wrote it in my ledger, dated, the way I wrote everything. The next morning after the storm, Warren came downstairs with the easy warmth he produced after bad nights, as though the previous evening had established nothing, changed nothing, meant nothing at all. He poured his own coffee. He smiled at me across the kitchen island with the campaign event smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just want to make sure you get everything you've earned at the hearing next month," he said. "I'll be right there beside you." I passed him the creamer, said nothing. In my jacket pocket, my phone was recording. I had started recording 2 weeks earlier. On the advice of a veterans advocacy line, I had called from Ironwood's back office when I was certain Warren would not be in the building. I had not told Warren. I had not told anyone except the one person I was about to call. That afternoon, I called Brid. Brid had been my roommate at Georgia Tech, the kind of friend who does not require maintenance and shows up at exactly the moment you need her to. She was now a forensic accountant in Atlanta, and she picked up on the second ring. I sat in my parked car behind Ironwood Hotels, where the alley cameras would show me there if I ever needed them to, and I told her everything. I told her about the sweep account and the authorization language and Blackwell campaign consulting. I told her about the unsigned document he had left on my dresser. I told her about the note to Dr. Ansel. I told her about the night of the storm. I was precise and ordered, the way I always am, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Miriam," she said, "I need you to photograph every financial document you can find and send them to me tonight. Every account statement going back as far as you have, every transfer record, anything in his name or both your names or connected to that consulting company. Tonight, if you can." I told her I had most of it already. I had been photographing documents for 6 weeks. She said, "Good, don't change anything. Don't move a single account. Don't say a word to him. Just keep being exactly who he thinks you are." I told her that was the one thing I was already very good at. What Brid found, over the following 9 days, was methodical and devastating and deeply, precisely criminal. She called me back on a Thursday evening, and I could hear from the quality of her silence before she spoke that what she was about to tell me was not just bad but structural, the kind of damage that does not come from carelessness, but from planning. Over the course of 18 months, $87,000 had moved from my VA back pay account to the Blackwell Campaign Consulting sweep account. $87,000, moved in increments sized carefully to stay beneath the federal reporting threshold. The timing corresponded exactly to deposits I had made after my quarterly VA disbursements. The money did not go to campaign expenses. It went, Brid told me, to a single vendor listed in the company's filings as a strategic communications consultant. The vendor's name was Tessa Crane. I wrote it down. That same week, through the Veterans Advocacy Network my social worker had connected me to the previous spring, I was referred to Yuki Tanaka. Yuki was a former JAG attorney who now ran a private practice focused exclusively on veterans' financial and legal rights. She had handled 42 cases in the 7 years since she had left the Judge Advocate General's Corps. She had never lost one. I walked into her office on a Tuesday morning with my notebook, a folder of photographed documents, and Brid's preliminary financial summary printed on plain paper. Yuki looked up from her desk. She was not the kind of person who makes small talk. She opened the folder and read for 11 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up and said, Let him think the hearing is about your benefits. It is not. It is about his crimes. I nodded. She said, tell me everything in the order it happened and tell me nothing you are not completely certain of. I took out my notebook and I began. Outside the window, a live oak was moving in a light river wind. Recon lay on the floor beside my chair, his chin on his paws. I spoke for 40 minutes and Yuki wrote without stopping, and when I finished, she looked at the stack of notes she had made and said, quietly, he underestimated you at every single step. I said, yes, he did. There was a pause. Good, she said. Let's use that. For the 5 weeks between my conversation with Yuki and the morning of the hearing, I was exactly the woman Warren believed he had married. I ran Ironwood. I made dinner. I agreed, calmly, whenever Warren raised the topic of the benefits hearing, that it would be wonderful to have everything settled. I let him believe I was still considering signing the settlement account document. I told him I just needed a few more days to look it over, which kept him patient and slightly off balance in a way that was useful. He needed me compliant for a few more weeks. I needed him confident for the same amount of time. We were, in that sense, perfectly matched. Yuki had made one call that I had not expected. She had reached out to Colonel Harriet Song, who had been my commanding officer for 2 of my 3 years in theater and was now retired and living in Columbus, Georgia, 45 minutes from Fort Benning. Colonel Song had not hesitated for 1 second when Yuki explained the situation. I will be on that video call, she said. Tell me when and where. That was the entirety of her response. Then, 10 days before the hearing, something happened that I had not planned for and could not have arranged myself. Francesca called me, not Warren me, directly, at 9 in the morning when she knew he would be at a council session. Her voice, when I picked up, had a texture I had never heard in it before. Not warmth, not the practiced charity board composure. Something underneath both of those things, something taut. She had been at Warren's campaign office the previous afternoon, she said, looking for a set of donor contact sheets she had helped compile. She had gone through the wrong folder by mistake. Inside it, she had found the guardianship petition, her name on the notary referral section, the paralegal firm she had directed, the filing date set for the Monday after the hearing. She had known Warren was building a case for her to help manage my affairs. She had not known there was a document with her name on it, set to be filed with the county court in 11 days. I said nothing. I let her talk. She said, Miriam, I want you to know I didn't understand the extent of what he was doing. I thought we were helping you. There was a silence. If there is a way to, if this could be handled quietly. Of course, Francesca, I said. Of course. I ended the call. I opened my notebook. I wrote down every word she had said, dated and timed. Then I called Yuki. Yuki listened to the full account without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, she found the one document that has her name on it, and now she wants a quiet resolution. A pause. She's not going to get one, but it's good that she's rattled. Rattled people make mistakes before the hearing. I agreed that they did. Francesca came to the house 2 days before the hearing. She sat in the parlor and drank the tea I poured her, and she talked about what a wonderful thing it was that Warren was going to be there to help me through the process. These hearings can be so overwhelming, she said, and you've been under so much stress. It's such a relief that Warren is managing things for you. I refilled her cup and agreed that it was a relief. She reached out and patted my hand. Her rings were cold against my knuckles. You just let Warren do the talking today, sweetheart. He knows how these things work. No one expects you to manage all this alone anymore. I looked at her. She had a kind face, Francesca, the practiced kind face of a woman who had spent decades on charity boards performing warmth for an audience. She had spent the last 10 days knowing her name was on a legal document she could not take back, and she had come here anyway, and she was still performing. The commitment to the performance, even now, was almost something to admire. I saw them to the door that evening, both of them, because Warren had arrived to drive her home, and I stood on the Jones Street steps and watched their car pull away. Recon sat beside me, warm against my left leg. The river smell was coming off the squares, the low, green, tidal smell that Savannah gets in September. I looked up the block, at the Spanish moss moving in the lamplight. I thought about every evening I had sat with my notebook, every document I had photographed, every date I had written down, every word I had heard and not answered and filed away. say nothing, miss nothing. That had been the whole work for 6 weeks. ND, the work was done. Okay, boy, I said to Recon, and we went inside. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and clear for September, the kind of Savannah morning that feels borrowed from somewhere further north, with a sharp light off the river and a stillness in the squares that made everything look like a photograph. I woke at 5:15, as I had every morning since Kandahar, and I lay in the dark for a moment with Recon's breathing filling the room, and I thought about the folder on the kitchen counter. The folder that Yuki had helped me build section by section over 5 weeks. It was unremarkable to look at, a plain manila envelope, letter-sized, held closed with a single binder clip. There was no drama in its appearance. That was the point. I dressed carefully, dark navy fitted jacket, low heels, my grandmother's watch on my left wrist, the one I had worn in uniform, nothing showy, nothing that would read to the panel as anything other than composed and credible. Recon had his vest on, the official service animal vest that the VA had issued along with his certification, with the patch on the side that read, "Do not pet working dog." I clipped his lead. I picked up the folder. I walked to the door. Warren was waiting by the car, dressed in the charcoal suit he wore to council appearances. He had his campaign-ready expression on, the one that projected competent, caring husband standing by his wife. He had told 2 council colleagues that he would be unavailable all morning because he was supporting Miriam at her VA hearing. He had said it with an expression of gentle, patient concern that I had been told about by a mutual friend who heard it and did not know what it meant. I knew what it meant. He needed to be the caring husband on record, in multiple witnesses' memories. For the morning, he had planned to be the last morning I managed my own affairs. I got in the car. I said good morning. He said good morning. We drove to the hearing room in a companionable silence that, from the outside, must have looked like the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had been together long enough not to need words. From the inside, it was something else entirely. The Chatham County VA Benefits Review hearing room was on the 3rd floor of a building on Bay Street, a rectangular room with fluorescent lights and a long table at the front where 3 VA panel members would sit. There were seats for perhaps 30 people along the walls. When we arrived at 8:50, Francesca was already there, in a pale blue jacket, seated near the back with her reading glasses on her nose and a leather portfolio in her lap, as though she had come to take notes. I had not invited Francesca. She had invited herself, and Warren had told her when and where without telling me. I noted it, said nothing. Yuki was already in the room, seated at the small table to the left of the panel's long one. She had a laptop open in front of her and her own folder, which was thicker than mine, and she did not look up when I came in. She did not need to. We had spoken on the phone the previous evening and again at 7 that morning. She knew everything she needed to know. The only thing left was the execution. The panel came in at 9 exactly, 3 officials in their 50s, 2 men and a woman, the kind of faces that have heard every version of every story and are trained not to show what they think. The woman in the center, whose nameplate read Senior Hearing Officer Delaney, acknowledged us both, noted Warren as a support person of record, and opened my file. She began with a review of my documented conditions, the traumatic brain injury, the PTSD diagnosis, the current treatment plan. Warren, beside me, nodded at appropriate intervals, the caring husband, the steady hand. Then Senior Officer Delaney said, "Mr. Blackwell, you submitted a statement to this panel regarding your wife's current functional status. We'd like to give you the opportunity to speak to that now." Warren leaned slightly forward. He folded his hands on the table, and he began to tell them about me. He was good at it. I had known he would be. He used the language of love and concern with the precision of someone who had rehearsed, describing my significant episodes of disorientation, my difficulty managing complex tasks, his worry that the stress of running Ironwood hotels had become too much for where she is right now. He talked about the night I had misplaced my keys as though it were an event he had witnessed rather than a story he had revised. He mentioned a morning when I had forgotten a meeting, which was true. I had forgotten one meeting in 2 years because I had put the wrong date in my calendar, the kind of thing that happens to every person alive, and he described it to the panel as evidence of a concerning pattern. His voice was measured. His expression was careful. His hands stayed still. I sat beside him and I let him talk. I looked at the table in front of me and I breathed, and I let him build every word of his case in front of the panel and in front of Francesca in the back row and in front of the VA fraud investigator. A quiet man in a gray suit named Mr. Prout, who had slipped in after us and taken a seat at the end of the room, and whom Warren had not noticed at all. Under the table, Recon pressed his weight against my left leg. The slow, firm pressure he used when he read something rising in me before I had registered it myself. I put my hand down and rested it on his back. I breathed. I waited. Yuki had called Mr. Prout. He worked out of the regional VA Inspector General's office in Atlanta. She had sent him Brid's financial summary and my account records 2 weeks ago. He had driven down the night before and called Yuki at 8:15 this morning to confirm he was coming. "Don't tell her husband," he had said, and Yuki had said, "I wasn't planning to." When Warren finished, he sat back. Senior Officer Delaney made a note. She said, "Mrs. Alderton, would you like to respond?" I opened my folder. "Yes," I said. "I have some things I'd like the panel to see." The first document was the original account authorization form, the one Warren had given me 14 months ago, the one I had signed without reading carefully enough. I handed it to the bailiff to pass to the panel. I explained what a sweep account was, what the 48-hour transfer window meant, and which account the money had been sweeping into. Warren's expression did not change. He had prepared for this possibility. He had prepared an explanation, a story about household expenses, about putting marital assets in one place for efficiency, about how I had agreed to all of it. He was ready. What he was not ready for was the second document. That was Brid's forensic summary, with her signature and credentials at the bottom, and a 12-month ledger of every transfer that had moved from my VA back pay account to Blackwell Campaign Consulting. $87,000, column by column, each transfer dated and timed. Senior Officer Delaney looked at the first page and looked up. Warren's jaw moved slightly. Just slightly. "Could you explain what Blackwell Campaign Consulting is?" she asked him. He said it was a business entity he had set up for administrative purposes related to his counsel work. She asked whether it had received VA disability funds. He said there may have been some commingling of accounts, that it was being looked into, that there were explanations he could provide with proper documentation at a later date. The panel woman to his right made a note. The man to his left looked at Mr. Prout, and Mr. Prout looked back at him with the small, neutral expression of a man who has already done most of his work. The third document was the vendor payment record, Tessa Crane, Strategic Communications Consultant, $54,000 over 18 months, paid entirely from the account funded by Miriam Alderton's VA disability back pay. Francesca, in the back row, had stopped writing in her leather portfolio. Warren's hands were no longer folded. They were flat on the table, and they were not quite steady. I did not look at him. I was looking at the panel. The fourth document was a collection of the letters that had been sent to Dr. Ansel over a period of 2 years. 8 separate written communications describing my supposed episodes, my cognitive decline, my inability to manage my affairs. They were signed Warren Blackwell. They were on letterhead, not official letterhead, but a version of it, with a formatting and font selection clearly designed to read as clinical correspondence rather than a spouse's unsolicited opinion. Dr. Ansel had never been told they were coming. Each letter had arrived, been added to my file, and shaped the picture of my mental health that the panel was now looking at. Dr. Ansel, whom Yuki had called the previous week, had been unaware they were in his file until Yuki asked him to look. When he found them, he had called Yuki back within 4 minutes. I handed copies across the table. I said, "My psychiatrist was not informed these letters were coming. He has not verified their contents and in fact disputes the characterization of my condition they contain. He has provided a written statement to that effect, which is in the folder." A written statement from Dr. Ansel was, in fact, in the folder. It had arrived by email at 11:17 the previous evening. Warren was very still now. The kind of still I recognized, not the still of patience or strategy, but the still of a person whose plan has encountered something it didn't account for and has not yet processed what happens next. "There is one more thing," I said. I told the panel about the unsigned document. The one Warren had left on my dresser the night he put Recon outside in the storm, the sole withdrawal. Elwright's authorization for my VA settlement account. I described the night. The storm advisory, the dinner, Recon outside in the rain for 2 hours, and Warren coming upstairs with a financial document and a tone of patient instruction. Senior Officer Delaney's expression had not changed from its baseline professional neutrality, but her pen had stopped moving. The man to her right was looking at Warren. Warren said, "I think there's been some mischaracterization of what was a difficult period in our marriage. We were working through some things. Miriam has had some challenges that have been hard on both of us." He said it with the practiced empathy of someone who has said a version of it many times and found that it usually worked. Then Yuki pressed a key on her laptop. The room's speaker crackled once, and then Warren's voice came out of it. His voice, clear and close, talking to someone I did not know in what sounded like a parked car. "Once the hearing is done and the house transfer goes through," he was saying, "we're clear. She'll have the guardian on record and I'll have the authorization. 2 weeks, maybe 3? A pause. A woman's voice, Tessa's voice, which I had never heard before and recognized instantly, said, "And she doesn't have any idea." Warren said, "She doesn't have the fight left. She never did." The silence after Yuki stopped the recording was the kind of silence that takes up physical space. Senior Officer Delaney looked at Warren for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to need to ask you to step back from the table." He didn't move immediately. She said it again, more clearly, "Please step back from the table." He pushed back his chair. His face had gone a particular color, not white, but the color of something that has drained. Yuki said, "We have one more item if the panel will permit." Senior Officer Delaney nodded. The screen at the front of the room, which the building used for video depositions, came on. Colonel Harriet Song looked out from it in civilian clothes, her posture the same as it had been in every briefing I had ever attended under her command. She identified herself, gave her service record and years of command, and then said, with a precision that I felt in my sternum, "Miriam Alderton served under my command for 2 of her 3 years in theater. I have known her for 11 years. She is the most logistically capable, the most accurate, and the most mentally organized officer I have ever supervised. If anyone in this room believes she is incapable of managing her own affairs, I would encourage them to review the documentation she has just presented you. She built that case while managing a business and a household and a marriage to the man who was trying to dismantle her. If that is cognitive incapacity, I have never seen a clearer mind." She looked directly into the camera. "I also want the panel to know," she said, "that I was the one who made the initial referral to the VA Advocacy Network when I heard what was happening, because Miriam Alderton would not ask for help herself. She never has, she just handles things." There was a pause. She handled this. The room was quiet. Francesca had closed her leather portfolio. Mr. Prout had stood up from his chair at the end of the room, and he was walking toward the front. I looked at Warren just once. He was looking at the table. "You put my dog out in the storm," I said, quietly, just to him, just the 2 of us in a room full of people who were all listening, "because you thought I had nothing left to fight with. You were wrong. I had everything. I just hadn't shown it to you yet." He had no answer for that. There wasn't one. Mr. Prout asked Warren to remain in the building for the remainder of the morning. He used that phrase specifically, "remain in the building," in the flat, courteous voice of a federal official who is not asking. Warren stood very still for a moment, and I watched him process the recalibration in real time, the moment when a man who has spent 2 years being certain finally understands that the certainty was built on something that was never actually there. He sat down in the chair by the wall. He did not look at me. He did not look at Francesca. He looked at the middle distance the way people do when they are trying to locate the version of events in which this is still recoverable, and finding that the version does not exist. I had seen that expression on other faces before, in other rooms, in the army, when a situation shifted from manageable to irretrievable, and the person in charge of it understood which side of the line they were now standing on. There is a particular quality to that recognition. It has no sound. Senior Officer Delaney adjourned the formal hearing portion and asked Yuki and me to remain for a consultation with the panel. Mr. Prout joined us at the table. Francesca, in the back row, had not moved. I think she was waiting for Warren to tell her what to do next, the way she had always waited for the men in her life to manage the shape of a crisis. But Warren was occupied, and so she sat very still in her pale blue jacket with her closed leather portfolio in her lap, and she looked like what she was, a woman who had helped plan something and was now watching it fail. The consultation lasted 45 minutes. Mr. Prout outlined what the Inspector General's office had already established from Brid's records and the account documentation Yuki had provided 2 weeks prior. The transfers from my VA back pay account to Blackwell Campaign Consulting constituted a misappropriation of federal benefits, a federal offense under Title 38, which governs veterans' benefits, and potentially under wire fraud statutes depending on how the sweep account mechanism had been established. The forged letters to my psychiatrist were a separate matter. The use of fraudulent documentation in a VA proceeding carries its own federal weight. The total picture, the sweep account, the transfers, the false clinical correspondence, the unsigned sole withdrawal authorization, and the guardianship petition, was not a collection of overlapping mistakes. It was a coordinated scheme. Mr. Prout said that plainly and without editorial commentary, the way someone states a geographic fact. Yuki had brought the guardianship petition, which she had obtained through a contact at the county clerk's office 3 days earlier. It had been drafted by a paralegal firm Francesca used, signed by Warren, and was dated for filing the following Monday. It named Warren Blackwell as Miriam Alderton's legal guardian on the grounds of cognitive incapacity. Attached was a 2-page summary of supposed clinical evidence, drawn from the very letters Warren had sent to Dr. Ansell, which Dr. Ansell had never authorized to be used as evidence of anything. When Mr. Prout described the guardianship petition to the panel, Senior Officer Delaney set down her pen. She looked at the document for a moment, and then she said, "We would have received this petition as supplemental context for today's hearing." She said it quietly and without expression, but the meaning was precise. Warren had been planning to file the guardianship petition on Monday so that it would arrive in the panel's hands as supporting evidence for his account of my mental state, retroactively anchoring everything he had said this morning in something that looked like legal documentation. The scheme had a sequence. It had a timeline. And it had depended entirely on Miriam Alderton not knowing what was coming. Mr. Prout asked the bailiff to invite Warren back to the table. Warren's attorney, who had not been present that morning because Warren had not told him about the hearing, apparently intending to manage it himself, arrived at 12:45 and immediately asked for a recess. He was a civil attorney named Beau, a partner at a firm that handled council members' personal legal work, and he was visibly not equipped for what he walked into. He read the materials Mr. Prout had organized on the table, and then he asked Warren, in a low voice he did not intend to carry, whether there was anything else he should know about. Warren said something I did not hear. Beau's expression did not improve. They conferred in the hallway for 20 minutes, while Yuki and I sat at the table with our folders and our water glasses and Recon at my feet, exactly as patient as we had been all morning. I could hear Warren's voice through the door, not the words, but the register, the first time I had ever heard it without the layer of control that kept it managed in front of people, the register underneath all of that, which was something between anger and the particular desperation of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. I had heard versions of that register before, from other men in other kinds of difficulty. It always sounds the same. It sounds like a person discovering that confidence is not the same as being right. When they came back in, Beau asked whether a cooperation agreement was possible. Mr. Prout said that was a conversation for the United States Attorney's Office and that Mr. Blackwell should probably retain a criminal defense attorney rather than a civil one before those discussions took place. Beau looked at Warren. Warren said nothing. I looked at Warren then, for the second time that morning. He was wearing his charcoal council suit and his campaign watch, a Breitling he had purchased with the first transfer from my account, 14 months ago, as Brid's records had made clear. He looked like the version of himself that appeared in newspaper photographs, composed, civic, capable. But the photograph had been taken before anyone had turned on the lights behind the image. Now that the lights were on, what it had been hiding was visible to everyone in the room, and Warren was sitting in the center of it. Mr. Prout gathered his documents, told Warren not to make any financial transactions, not to access any joint account, and not to leave the state of Georgia. Then he nodded to me and to Yuki and to Colonel Song's dark screen, and he left. What happened to Warren Blackwell after that morning proceeded in stages, the way these things always do: first the machinery of investigation, then the machinery of consequence, both slower than you want them to be and more complete than the people being processed expect. The federal investigation was opened by the Regional VA Inspector General's office within the week. Brid's forensic summary, along with the account records and the recorded conversation Mr. Prout had added to the file as additional evidence, formed the core of the criminal referral. Charges were filed 4 months later: wire fraud, misappropriation of federal veterans' benefits, and filing fraudulent documentation in a federal proceeding, the letters to Dr. Ansel. Warren hired a criminal defense attorney from Atlanta, a skilled and expensive woman who negotiated and argued and found every available avenue. The evidence was comprehensive, it was clean, and it had been assembled by a logistics officer who had spent 6 weeks making sure there was no gap in it anywhere. Warren Blackwell was sentenced to 32 months in federal prison. The city council seat was vacated the week charges were filed. The campaign dissolved. Tessa Crane cooperated fully with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced personal exposure. The $54,000 was recovered as criminal restitution to my VA account, and Warren's promise that they would move somewhere quiet together turned out to be worth exactly what his promises were always worth. He was not free for 2 years and 8 months. As far as I know, she was not waiting. Francesca Blackwell's situation resolved in a different room, through different paperwork, with a different kind of finality. Yuki filed the civil suit against her personally 3 weeks after the criminal referral, naming her as a co-conspirator in the fraudulent guardianship petition, and as the party who had facilitated the forged notary stamp on the backdated power of attorney. That document, which would have allowed Warren to sell the Alderton house without my consent, was the detail that determined the extent of Francesca's personal liability. The notary stamp traced to a contact of hers at the Savannah Country Club, a retired legal secretary who had done what Francesca asked as a favor, and when interviewed by a federal investigator, had provided a written account of the request in exchange for full immunity. She described Francesca asking her to use the old stamp from her notary commission, which had expired. She described Francesca saying it was a family matter and that it just needed to look official. It looked official. It also constituted fraud. The civil judgment against Francesca was finalized 8 months after the hearing. The amount required her to liquidate a portion of the investment account she maintained separately from her late husband's estate. The money she had always referred to as her independence, the money she had used to signal, in small and large ways, that she was not a woman who needed to rely on anyone. She relied on it now to pay what she owed. Francesca stepped down from all 3 charity boards the week the civil suit was filed, at each board's suggestion, communicated by their respective chairs in phone calls she received within 48 hours of the news becoming public. Savannah society is a particular ecosystem, and the Blackwell name, which had once opened rooms in that ecosystem, had become the name that made people find something else to look at when it came up in conversation. Francesca moved to her sister's house in Hilton Head within the month. She did not send a Christmas card. I did not expect one. I did not spend energy on what she had intended. What she had intended was finished. I noted what she had done, I documented the consequences, and then I let her go. Some things require no more attention once they are done. There is a particular kind of morning I have had more often in the 2 years since the hearing. A morning where I wake without the specific weight I had carried for so long I had stopped noticing it was there. Recon is still at the foot of the bed. The light still comes through the gap in the live oaks at the same angle it always did. The Alderton house is still mine, the same heart pine floors, the same garden that gets the morning light, except that now the only person making decisions about it is me. I expanded Ironwood Hotels to a second property in Charleston 14 months after the hearing. It was a federal-style building on a narrow street 2 blocks from the Battery, understated from the outside, particular on the inside, the kind of hot that people find rather than stumble into. The opening week, the Charleston paper ran a piece about it, and the journalist asked me what I thought my greatest strength as a business owner was. I said, attention. She asked me to elaborate. I said that the most important thing a person can do, in business or anywhere else, is to pay exact and patient attention to what is actually happening, not to what they are being told is happening. The journalist wrote it down. The photograph they ran showed me in the lobby with Recon beside me, both of us looking directly at the camera. 3 months after the Charleston opening, Yuki Tanaka and I co-founded the Recon Project, a national legal clinic for veterans whose VA benefits or legal standing have been targeted by predatory partners. The name was Yuki's idea, and I agreed to it without hesitation. In our first operating year, we handled 14 cases in partnership with veterans service organizations that provided referrals. Brid joined the board as forensic accounting consultant. Colonel Song joined as our senior advisor. In the second year, we handled 21 cases. In the third, 34. The number keeps climbing, which is both what I hoped for and the thing that I wish were not necessary. The case that stayed with me longest that first year was a Navy corpsman from Biloxi, who had come home from deployment to find that her husband had refinanced her home twice while she was overseas, draining the equity into a business account she had not known existed. She was 29 years old, and she sat across from me in the Recon Project's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, very still, conserving something. I told her what Yuki had once told me, tell me everything in order and tell me nothing you are not certain of. She took a breath and she began. When she finished, I said, you noticed, you're here, that's the hardest part. Something in her face shifted, the first shift toward the thing on the other side of this. Now we do something about it, I said. We did. I testified before a Senate Veterans Affairs Subcommittee the following spring, on a panel convening to address financial protections for veterans in situations involving benefit misappropriation. I wore the same Navy jacket I had worn to the hearing in Savannah. Recon came with me, certified and vested, and lay under the table at my feet while I spoke into the microphone. The senator chairing the subcommittee asked me, near the end of my testimony, what I would want every veteran in a similar situation to know. That silence is not the same as surrender, I said. Sometimes silence is the most precise instrument you have. Sometimes the work of watching and documenting and waiting for exactly the right moment is the work that changes everything. The mistake people make is assuming that a quiet person has nothing to say. The quiet person is often the one who has the most to say, and has simply chosen when to say it. The room was quiet for a moment. Recon shifted under the table and pressed his warm weight against my ankle. I scratched behind his ear. I looked at the panel. I was calm and precise, and exactly who I had always been, the woman who learned, on a September night when the storm came in off the Georgia coast, and her husband opened the back door and thought he saw nothing behind her eyes, that the things we refuse to show are sometimes the most powerful things we carry. She said nothing, she remembered everything, she won. If you have ever let your silence do the work for you, if you have ever stayed still when every part of you wanted to speak, and then waited for exactly the right room, type "hush" in the comments. I want to know your story. And before you go, was her silence her greatest weapon, or did she wait too long? Side A says she should have spoken the moment she found that sweep account. Side B says she needed every single week she waited to build something that could not be dismantled. Tell me where you land. Until next time, stay quiet, stay dangerous.